Cool. Well, look, thank you everyone who's on the call right now for joining today. Um, my name is Alistair. I'm the founder of Justly. It's a one-person business. I'm purposely building a one-person business. And essentially what I do is I help startups and small businesses build trust through fair and transparent pay practices. My background is working in startups since 2010. I then moved into consulting in early 2018, doing everything in the employee life cycle, so a little bit of recruitment, onboarding, performance management, and everything else in between. But there was always this common thread, both my time in-house and when I was a consultant and running my previous business, of pay and growth always being that sort of tricky topic, the number one or number two in any employment engagement survey, and something I'm also felt always very passionate about since day one. So I set out, as I say, to build Justly, to help organizations bring clarity to pay. I've worked with around 70 companies today. It's probably closer to 80 now. And as I say, the core of what I do is helping organizations build salary bands and then documenting how they do it. So that's what I'm going to go through today. We're going to be focusing on the what and the how with a little bit of the why. I'll be making an assumption here. Hopefully everyone understands why salary bands are important. So I'm not going to go too much into that. There's lots of good, fantastic literature out there on that. But we're going to talk more around what you need in order to build them, how to build them, how do you know if your salary bands are actually right, and also some of the common mistakes I see people when building them. And don't get me wrong, I've made those mistakes as well in the past, but I'd say 50 to 60% of clients that I work with have already built salary bands, and then they'll come to me and say they're not working. There's too much overlap. We don't know how they were built. So as I say, I'll take you through those common mistakes that I've seen, and then at the end a summary of sort of how to do this. Want to be really explicitly clear, there's so much you can go into when building salary bands and talking about comp and pay. But what I want to be clear about is what we're not covering today. So I'm not going to be going deep on leveling frameworks and how to level your team and the job architecture piece, even though it's important. I'm not going to start diving into pay for performance principles, like how to move someone through a salary band or promotion principles. I'm not going to be talking about how transparent to be with salary bands. And I'm also not going to dig into location-based pay. All incredibly important parts, right, of building salary bands. But you could probably, well, I know for a fact, I could talk about each one of these for an hour on their own. So today, we're just going to rattle through the basics of how to build them, and what you need to build them. So with that said, very briefly, why salary bands matter. There's only one slide on this. And essentially, hopefully, we're all in an agreement here that they're really super important to give. Let's say I use the word clarity a lot. Give people clarity on what they're being paid, how they're being paid, and how they can essentially earn more as they grow and develop skills within your organization. So great for performance and promotion planning, help drive the pay equity, which is something very close to my heart, which essentially brought me into this when I was hiring into a team back in 2011, and we were bringing in people, and there was like, we all had the same job title, and one was on 60K and someone else was on 32K, and it just frustrated the hell out of me. So it helps drive that pay equity and build trust and transparency. Really useful for hiring teams. Salary bands and job adverts, again, I'm not going to go into that, but super powerful. And then also very critical for financial planning. So for your finance teams, they'll be very happy that there's an objective and formulaic way to approach pay within the organization, and numbers aren't just pulled out of a black box. So these are things that salary bands help you do. How do you then, or sorry, what do you then need to build salary bands? So what I've done and sort of distilled down, if you sort of think about how to build them and end up with like a payment grid that will look something similar to the one on the right here, is you need three key building blocks. You need job architecture, and I'm going to go into each one of these very quickly on the following slides, but you need job architecture. I think levels, career tracks, and job families. You need reliable and relevant data, so you need market data to start informing you on sort of what are the rates are for different roles and levels. And then you also need a compensation philosophy. And with those three things, you can then, as I say, start to form some state of salary bands within your organization. So just to be clear, this is sort of one structure for, say, the software engineering team. So job architecture, when I first learned about job architecture, and I've heard it thrown around many times, it used to scare the hell out of me, but it's really straightforward. We're talking about tracks, levels, and job families. That's how I think about job architecture personally. So tracks are the career paths, whether someone's going to be becoming a specialist in their role, the individual contributor or the professional track, or people who want to actually move into people management, so managing people as opposed to perhaps managing processes and becoming a specialist. You then have levels across these different tracks, so essentially defining how senior a role is, and then you're going to need to group roles together into certain groups. And again, I'm going to talk about these quickly on the next one and why they're important. So you need to level your roles. As I mentioned right at the beginning, this is probably one of the hardest parts of any project I ever do. Again, I'm not going to go into in great detail, but essentially what we're doing within an organization, or what you'll need to do, is take all of your roles that you have, all of the job titles and roles, and essentially pass them through a job leveling framework, carry out a job evaluation, it's sometimes called. And for that, you're going to need a leveling framework, and a lot of the salary benchmarking providers out there provide their own ones. And essentially start slotting them into, as I say, the different levels within that framework. The next thing that you're going to need to do as well is group roles into, as I say, certain groups. So there's different options out there. There's quite a lot of text on this slide, but essentially what I'm trying to demonstrate here, for an example of an engineering team, is you'll have perhaps back end, front end, full stack, machine learning, etc., etc. So we've got eight different roles here. And when you start to group them together, again, it depends on your philosophy, the way in which you pay people currently, or you wish to pay people in the future, depending on the criticality of those skills and other things, is either grouping them all into one department, so like really broadbanding it and having all of those roles into sort of one department, job family, or I think Mercer calls it job function, with Mercer being another data provider, and then a sub-family. So these are the different sort of options you have, and each one has essentially pros and cons with it, and there's no real right or wrong answer. It always depends on the organization. But that being said, I see most of the people I work with and clients I help sort of start to sort of gravitate towards option 2. So that's a little bit about job architecture. What else do you need? The second piece is market data. So depending again on the size of the organization, where you're located, the maturity of that organization, you're going to want to select a data source, or sources, plural. There's lots out there, Ravio, Pave, Willis Towers Watson, Mercer. There's a lot out there. There's also ones like levels.fyi, which is a little bit more of a sort of employee reported as opposed to employer reported benchmarking survey. But again, you're going to want to take this data, and there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, but this is going to start to give you the numbers and help you build credibility and trust in where those numbers have come from. And then the final thing was the compensation philosophy and your strategy around the way in which you're going to be paying. So the thinking behind these bands. So at its sort of root, compensation philosophy is how and why salaries are set the way they are. And it's your North Star for your compensation decisions. It's going to contain all information about all of comp. So not just base pay, it will talk about perhaps how you approach variable pay, or how you approach your equity schemes, or your benefits and things like that. But for the focus of today, I'm going to be talking about some of the thinking you need to do around how to set your base salary. So these are things I'm going to go into. One thing that I get a lot of, as well as why I put it here on the screen, is people go, well, I don't have a compensation philosophy. Well, actually, everyone does, right? If you've got people within your organization, you've hired people, every single one of those offers that you made, and the way you hired people, and the way that you've perhaps promoted people or moved people through perhaps this band that you have had, or an imaginary band. Every one of those decisions is essentially a philosophy. You've done it in an intentional way. It just hasn't been documented. And what you need to do is document it, and then also make sure it's consistently used across the organization. You don't have different teams doing different things, because that's to say where the carnage can happen, so to speak. So those are the three things you need. What you need. What if you don't have them all in place, which a lot of people don't? Can you start building salary bands? I always say yes, you can, but you'll need to start thinking about each of them, and you'll need to start thinking about the decisions that you made on your job architecture, on your market data sources, the decisions you made around your compensation philosophy, and document those. And what I find a lot is people have made some of these decisions, they just haven't documented it, or they've inherited a decision perhaps from another previous person who was running comp or running the people team or HR team, and no one really knew where it came from. This is your opportunity to start making these, as I say, codifying them, and ultimately, hopefully, moving towards a place where it can be made transparent and communicated to the rest of the business. So yes, you can start building salary bands, but do document the process that you go through in order to get there. So that's a little bit about the what you need. Now I'm going to go into the how to build salary bands. So hopefully this is the bit that's going to sort of bring everything to life. So very quickly, again, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, we've got the anatomy of a salary band, or what I call a salary structure, this grouping of bands here. This is for one job family, so let's call it customer success. And we have our levels. In this case, this particular organization has chosen to pay managers and ICs who are at the same level, the same band. Not always the case, but certainly seeing a trend towards that. I call this range here a salary band. Again, just to be completely transparent, other people might call that a pay band or a pay range. No right or wrong answer there, just want to make sure we're on the same page. And the important bit, what I'm going to take you through and how I build salary bands, which is a pretty standard way, is talking about the midpoint. And the midpoint is where your competitive market position goes. So where you want to place yourself in the market. So if you want to be targeting meet the market, you'll be targeting what's called the 50th percentile. If you want to be leading the market, you're going to be targeting the 75th or 90th percentile, or lagging the market, you'll be below that 50th. No right or wrong place to place yourself. You'll have perhaps different strategies for different teams based on criticality of role. But say the midpoint is what we use as an anchor to build the range from the minimum to the maximum, which I'm going to go into in a minute. A couple of quick things to run through here. Again, I will be sharing all of this afterwards, and there's stuff on my guide that talks about this, but some of the key considerations when building your salary bands is like how wide you should make them. Again, really depends on job family, different organizations, and as I say, it depends on, particularly as I say, the role and the growth within that role that you're expecting people to achieve. So perhaps in sort of roles like customer support, or maybe perhaps more administrative type roles, where the tenure within a level might be expected to be very short, you're going to have very narrow bands for quicker progression. Whereas in other roles, perhaps software engineer, you're going to have wider bands demonstrating a longer period of time within that level, even at the lower levels. So again, really depends. It could be 5 to 10%, it could be 20%. There's some industry sort of standard ones out there, but they tend to be, as I say, very dependent on company to company, and that's what I've seen when I work with people. That being said, some companies will set them all at, say, 25 or 30% and just be done with it. And again, it really depends on company to company. Next thing just to consider before we jump into actually building something and going through it practically is whether you should have overlapping bands or a stepped structure. So step structure, it's exactly what it means. There's a clear step between the max of one level and the minimum of the adjacent level above. Whereas Some organizations might want to have overlapping bands, so where the max overlaps with the minimum of the level above. Again, no right or wrong answers there. Probably talk for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour on this subject on what's right or wrong. There's lots of pros and cons, but to boil it all down, essentially band overlap gives people flexibility to keep paying people and rewarding them for their contributions without having to promote them to the level above, especially if perhaps there's no business need to move them into the level above. So that gives you a little bit more wiggle room. That being said, a lot of companies I work with find the concept of overlapping bands quite complicated and prefer the neatness, shall we say, of stepped bands. So again, no right or wrong answers there. Plenty of reading on my guide, which I'll share afterwards, that goes into these pros and cons. So choosing the right salary band, so how are we going to build these? How are we going to productionize, setting that midpoint, defining the bandwidth, and then how much overlap? So what I've done, and this is something that just to be clear, I'm completely self-taught on this, albeit I've been doing it for quite a long time. There's essentially 4 common models that any sort of pay practitioner, reward person would use. They're standard sort of industry mathematical models. So I've compiled them all into one sheet, and then I've designed one myself. I've not found it out there on the internet. I've never read about it. I'm sure other people will perhaps go, yeah, I've seen something similar, but it's one that I've built that is based on the feedback that I've had from clients that I've worked with. But essentially, when you start building salary bands in a spreadsheet, you'll probably have 2 decisions to make, or one decision on which one band to use. And it comes down to how much data you have. If you don't have a lot of data or there's holes in the data, you're going to be wanting to use the models in red. And if you have lots of data and you're really happy with it and it's really strong, then you'll be using the other ones on the right. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into this template here and salary band model sheet. So I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible. There are short Loom videos on my website that go into each one of these that you can watch in your own time after this. But if you're falling into I don't have much data, I've got 2 or 3 data points, or maybe even 1 data point, and I've used this one quite a few times on roles where really new emerging roles where people are like, we don't really have a number. We know what the starting salary is going to be, but we just need to build sort of a logical relationship between the other levels. This is simply plugging in at level 1 your midpoint for level 1, and then building essentially a percentage on top each time for each of these. And it just creates, as I say, this could be a perfectly linear relationship. It could be there's a 15% jump, there's a 20% jump. And I've sat down with hiring managers personally and clients, and then we put these numbers in, and then we've looked at what comes out the other end. We've also set that pay range spread, as I mentioned before, what the minimum to the maximum needs to be. And then essentially it's just looking at it pragmatically and saying, well, actually, you know what, we've got someone who's a level 4 right now, and we pay them around this number, and that looks about right. And it is essentially a bit of a guesswork, a bit of art, right? There's some science to it, but there's also art. You can, on all of the models, and I'll just show you on this one, and this is something I'd recommend always doing when you're sort of building salary bands, is you can press this little button up here. What this will do is it will show you a couple of like key things. Like it will show you how much overlap there is, what the band range is, so that growth within that level, how much there is. And this is where, as I say, you can start to sort of eyeball the numbers and think, like, does this make sense based on what our pay strategy needs to be? So that's one way of doing it. Very simple, straightforward model. Another model that I've seen people use, and have used myself a lot, is this one, which uses sort of exponential regression. Again, this can be used, this is really useful when there's like no data. So if anyone here has ever perhaps, I don't know, used any of the providers, I'm not going to throw shade to any of them, because I use them all. But let's just say you've got the data out, and there's data for perhaps level 1, 3, and then that's it. That's all you've got. What this will do is it will use the growth formula, which I didn't create. It's a formula which essentially uses exponential regression to say, based on the numbers you've given me and the levels, essentially extrapolate between those and fill in the holes. It creates a very, essentially a perfect curved relationship, which doesn't always represent market conditions, but it will help fill in the holes very, very quickly for you. And then again, you'll want to go through the process of defining your bandwidth, so how wide you want it. So again, really useful model for when pay doesn't progress or you've got holes in the data. Perhaps you've got all the data points. I was doing one today, and the rate for level 2 was like 27,000, and the rate for level 1 was higher. It happens. Those things happen. Again, this will fix that for you very, very quickly. So, one way to go about it. So those are don't have much data. Perhaps you've got access to lots of data. So there's 3 models here. Really simple one, which you might well have used or seen in the past. Some of you might have used this model. All we're doing here is we're taking that market data from the provider and we're slotting it into that midpoint, and we're just doing a spread either side. So it's not a pay range spread from the minimum to the maximum, it's a spread either side of that midpoint. So in this case, we're saying 10% this way and 10% that way. Again, it's a slightly different way of doing the spread versus the pay range spread. Again, I'm not going to go into reasons as to why one is better than the other. There's reasons on my website, but in essence, I prefer pay range spread. It's a little bit more mathematically accurate. But this is a way to say, build a range very quickly. And what a lot of the platforms like Figures and Ravio, if any of you have used those platforms, they'll use this approach here. That being said, one of the drawbacks is, I'm just going to open up the stats, is you don't have control over the amount of overlap. You would have to start playing around with these percentages and knocking them down in order to try to reduce the overlap. So you get into a place where you're playing around with these, but you're also at the mercy of the market data and the proximity of one level to another, and that will cause also the amount of overlap as well. So you would have to start modifying these, and you'd have to start modifying these in order to essentially create your overlap or lack of overlap. So it gets a little bit messy, something that I struggled with, and ended up then working with people to do this model. So second to last model, and then I'll be hopefully finished in record time. So this one is, okay, we've built perhaps maybe you've built using this model here, you've built your range, but you're not happy with the fact that this doesn't overlap with this. There's like a massive jump between 77 and 81. So what I've found a lot of people like to do, once they've built sort of a straw man set of bands, is go, right, now I'm going to give the CTO or the head of engineering a bit of a blank canvas, but it's market informed over here, but I'm going to let them fill in these the way that they want. And they just manually say, right, it's going to be 29 to 34. I don't want an overlap. I'm going to do 34 there. So these match up, 41, 41. So more manual, but again, I found specifically with engineers, software engineers, they like having that ability to tinker with it a little bit. That being said, when you do obviously start to do this calculated midpoint, the halfway between the two, will start to deviate away from the market data. So it's something to recognize, like all of a sudden we're now paying according to what we had here. And this isn't a perfect example, by the way, but you need to be cognizant that your market midpoints, because you're forcing the ends, will start to move away from each other. So it's something to bear in mind. But this one was as manual and as old school as it seems. I've found goes down very well with a lot of people once they've perhaps built something more market driven like this. Close those up. And then the last one, so the last how. So this is the one that I've been using for a while now. So it's a bit of a mix of all of the models, if you like. But essentially what we're doing here is we're entering the raw market data. And ideally you do have some nice, clean, no holes market data. But maybe in some cases you don't. Maybe this is, I don't know, 57,000, whereas the level below is 54. So the jump between the two isn't that high. There's something wrong with the data that we've been given and we've pulled in our reports. So you enter your data, you interrogate it, you look at the market midpoints. You want these to be reasonably uniform, but you notice there's an anomaly here. So in this step here, you'll need to smooth that data. This is a process that you can do using exponential regression or linear regression or polynomial regression. But having done this again a number of times, I found one of the best ways personally is people to go in and go, right, I'm just going to add on an amount just to smooth it out and make it something that makes sense to me. So in this case, all I'm going to do is go into this column here and add a bit of a premium. So I'm going to put on perhaps 30%. That now is taken that number and it's now 74,000 and it makes a little bit more sense. Actually, sorry, it's taking the number below and it's adding on 30%, so it's taking that 54. You can see we've now got something that looks a little bit more logical. There is an argument, you say, well, this is very manual. I don't want to have to go through this and do it for like 20 job families. Fine, use the exponential regression model. But personally, I've used both and I find much better and you get closer to the data and you start to appreciate sometimes the anomalies in it. And this makes you, quite frankly, a lot more confident when talking about it with people as well, that the fact that there is problems with market data, unless sample sizes are huge, which isn't always the case for certain emerging roles and certain locations as well. So we've smoothed the data. It's what the providers recommend. You know, Pave's got a guide on how to smooth data and they tell you should smooth data and they have problems with their data. Then you're going to set the bandwidths as we did in the previous models, so set that pay range spread, lower percentages at lower levels to demonstrate quicker and narrower bands, and wider ones up here. And then the last step, and this is the bit that gives you the ultimate control, is defining how much overlap you want. So in this case, the overlap is none, right? 0%, 35, 800 maps to that, and so forth, as you can see. Now, what you can do is then add a positive percentage in to say we want overlap. Again, anywhere between perhaps 5 to 10% overlap. So I'm going to put in 5% across the board. And now we have overlapping bands by those amounts. And as always, you can press this little plus here, and then it will show you like how much overlap we've got and the percentage overlap as well. That being said, like with the other model, if you recall, when you start playing around with essentially the bottom and top of a band, you're going to start messing around with that market midpoint. So that 50,000 is a little bit further away from that 54,000. But broadly speaking, like just eyeballing across these, we're sort of within, in my opinion, a reasonably good tolerance. But again, this is something to think about when you're, say, being formulaic and setting those bands. So that's the last model there. It might be worth actually also just saying you can also put in a negative percentage. So I've had not many, but I've had a couple of clients say, I actually want there to be a very clear step. I want there to be a gap. So there's a meaningful increase from this one to this one and so forth. So again, that's something that you can do that. So a little bit about the template. You can, if you put all of the same numbers in there, this is something that some people do, just close that up and do that. But if you put all of the same numbers in, essentially you can then compare the different models and sort of line graphs across this as well. So those are the models that I've used, I've tried, I've built with varying degrees of success based on amount of data that I have. How do you then know if your salary bands are right? So maybe you've gone through the process, you've taken one job family, let's say software, and you've built the bands yourself, and you can do it perhaps in isolation. How do you know actually if they're going to be something that is actually going to work for your team? And the only way you're going to really be able to assess that is by testing the bands and carrying out a pay equity analysis. So hopefully this graph sort of demonstrates what I'm trying to communicate here. Each of these blocks represents a band. We've got some overlapping bands here and depth here. But ultimately what we're trying to identify is who within that job family, let's say this is one job family, software team, who's below the range, who's within it, and then who's above. Now, conversations will need to be had with everyone, quite frankly, but you want to understand, if you're going to be transparent about your pay bands and you want to go out and release them and talk about them, you're going to need to make sure that you bring all of these red dots. And it's slightly confusing because usually people say red dots are at the top of the band or above range, but I use a slightly different approach. It's just the way my brain works. I use the traffic light type approach, but you're going to want to use all these red dots who are below. They're going to need to be adjusted and moved to within a band. How much that's going to cost you to do? Or you go back to the drawing board and you say, actually, we've chosen a far too aggressive market position and we chose the 75th. We can't afford it. We're going to move to the 50th. Build your band again and then see all the bands shift down, and you'll see these reds, hopefully, depending on how far away they are, shift to within that band. So that's the only real true test of understanding whether they're going to really work for you. Obviously, there's the finance team to bring in those conversations as well. I'm going to go through very quickly the last few slides, and then I'll open the sort of Q&A up. But common mistakes I see. So I think there's, aside from not keeping a paper trail and documenting everything, which happens all the time, hopefully less of it happening these days with fantastic AI note takers and so forth. But aside from not keeping a paper trail, on the job architecture side, people over-engineering their first leveling framework and going absolutely all out and trying to create some incredibly noble but very complicated, over-the-top, skills-based framework. And you really don't need to. You need to start with the basics there. And I've got some content on that on my guide that talks about the differences between your first leveling framework versus something that's you're going to perhaps need in 2 years' time. Not involving managers with the leveling process. So yes, you can level the team perhaps to a certain degree if you've got job descriptions and you want to go through and map those using the leveling framework, but ultimately you do need to bring managers in on that process to get their buy-in. And also jumping in and leveling people. So using the phrase, and I learned this off a chap in the US, leveling the role, not the soul. So it's really important when you do this for the first time is to level your roles in the organization, not make it about the person. It does creep in, that happens, and bias can get into it, but you can be as objective as possible. In an ideal world, you've got all of your job roles, perfect job descriptions. Now with the power of AI and different GPT models, you can feed those in, feed it into your leveling framework, and it will do all the leveling for you. And then you just get the managers to sense check. Bringing people into it, that's where you're talking about performance and bias, and that's where, as I say, these exercises can start to derail. Market data, people, a lot of, again, I work with quite a lot of people who come to me and say, we signed up to provider X or provider Y, and then quickly realize, don't know how to use the data source, and it was perhaps the wrong data source. So, I've got a client right now who signed up to Willis Towers Watson, probably shouldn't have been Willis Towers Watson, it probably should have been Mercer, and that's quite an expensive mistake. But they've got two data sources, so it's not the end of the world. But one of them is not going to be perhaps as robust as they anticipated. If you want a shoestring, you don't always need to pay for data, albeit it does help build credibility. And the more, if you're able, and you do have budget to use on something like a Radford or a Pave, fantastic. But there are a lot of free resources out there that you can use, as long as you document where it came from, where that number came from, why you think it's actually valid, and so forth. Especially now with salary bands on job adverts in a lot of locations in the US, you can use tools to go out there, or there are platforms that will do all that scraping for you and you pay a price, or you could sit down and do it yourself and spend an hour or two doing it. Again, really good valid data sources, especially if you don't have budget. And then also the one that sort of perhaps slightly contentious, but a lot of people with a lot of these new tools out there, they're fantastic, don't get me wrong, but the real-time data piece is also both a gift and a curse. People thinking they need to refresh their bands every month because they've been notified that the bands have updated, and you don't need to do that unless there's extenuating circumstances that trigger, like, gosh, we've had loads of people leave and walk out the door because of pay and we can't hire anyone because of pay. Fine, refresh your benchmarks, but every 6 months, if not every 12 months, you're not going to be asking the finance team to rebudget every quarter. So I don't think you need to refresh your bands every quarter either. Last one, compensation philosophy. So as I say, not aligning early on key design choices and bringing people on that journey. So I always recommend, once you've made some decisions yourself, you need to put those in front of not just one person, like the CEO. I recommend creating a small compensation committee and just getting their buy-in. And then also say that will help build credibility, because they're the ones who are on the front line who are going to have to answer questions about this and ultimately field questions about your comp philosophy and the choices that you made. So you need to make sure they're bought into that. And that, I say, that builds on that sort of making sure it's an inclusive build. Last one, and then I think I'm done. The last one that I see a lot of people doing, and I've had to sort of mop up this mess a few times, is using percentiles to build band ranges. So what I mean by that, I've got a separate slide here. People will choose for a level 1, they'll say we pay between the 25th and the 75th percentile. So they'll use the 25th for min, the 75th for the max, and then the midpoint would be the 50th or whatever the calculator says. That causes a lot of problems, as this graph sort of shows here. You get massive varying spreads across different levels. The market volatility, especially in these new providers that are bringing on new companies all the time and perhaps losing companies, their data sources go pretty haywire, no matter how much their incredible data science teams do things that I probably couldn't even comprehend to clean the data. Really wouldn't recommend using that process. Use a fixed range pay range spread, use a midpoint as your anchor, and then build consistently off that using your pay range spreads, and then your approach to overlapping bands, because as I say, it's a hell of a lot easier, and I've had to fix a few that sat on the left side in the past. So yeah, how long? 40 minutes. Wow. Simple process to follow. So I tried to distill it down all into sort of one band build checklist. So start with one job family, just have a muck around, build it end to end. If you've got levels and tracks and stuff like that, great, you can jump through quite a few steps. But if you haven't, you are going to need to start there, which is a little bit painful. Select a couple of sources if you can. Start to triangulate on which maybe source is the best. If you can't, again, just start basic with some credible crowdsourced data. Start drafting your compensation philosophy, thinking about the percentiles you want to target, why you want overlapping bands, build a bit of a business case behind it, but document those decisions and build the bands. Then share with a small group of stakeholders, maybe just, let's say, again, we're doing the engineering team, just share with perhaps the CTO and VP of Eng, get their opinion on it. 9 times out of 10, they've probably got some salary bands that they've already built, perhaps even ones you've never been shown or told about, and you're like, wow, this is enlightening. That happens a lot. I'm seeing quite a few of those calls. As I say, what you're trying to do here is build a structure and approach that then, to say, acts as your blueprint. So test those bands, get to a point where you're quite comfortable, and then, as I say, align on what becomes your blueprint and standardize what you can where appropriate, but also give different teams flexibility, particularly obviously on that market midpoint, maybe on, I'd say, bandwidth, but I would try and standardize things like all job families. We have either a step structure or overlapping, because if you have some that do and some that don't, that can cause confusion. You might want to also this feedback loop. So based on what you can and can't afford, as I mentioned earlier on, I get on plenty of calls. We pay in the 75th percentile, Alistair. Okay, let's see if you truly do. We plug the data in, and then actually, yeah, you do, but only for 4 out of 20 people, and you've got 10 who are below band. Did you know that? And that's when they sort of quite enlightened. So there's a bit of a feedback loop here. And then essentially, I make it sound easy, but like, you're going to want to rinse, repeat that process. Cool. That was a lot of me talking, and 40 odd minutes in. Questions. I have not used the Q&A function on this before, but there should be down in the bottom right hand corner a 3x3 grid where people can put questions in, which I'll be happy to answer if people see those. They should be able to answer, submit questions. Cool. So one from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Do you have any thoughts regarding, instead of having structured pay grades, assigning pay ranges to each job? So I've done that before. The reason if you're starting to value, essentially that comes back to, if I'm thinking correctly about your question, Sarah, that is where you're going to essentially be valuing each job essentially as a subfamily. You can do it that way, that's absolutely fine, but you're going to have, it's the highest precision for benchmarking and pay accuracy. It's super high maintenance. And in a lot of the companies I work in, you'll have, I don't know, again, I'm going to stick with the engineering example here. You'll have front-end engineers, back-end engineers, full stack. They're all sort of mixing and doing the same stuff, even though they have different disciplines. And sometimes telling a front-end engineer, by the way, we don't value as much as a back-end engineer, especially when they're wearing multiple hats and doing different things, is a pretty tricky and not conversation you probably want to have. So in the earlier days, again, early days when perhaps it's a 20-person engineering team, and again, everyone's wearing multiple hats, I would encourage to go more towards this grouping, maybe head towards this sort of range for each job once you're a much larger team and have got more established, and you want to build specific strategies for each of them, and you're happy to talk about them as well. David's put in a couple of questions here. Thank you, David. If you're a smaller company and data is really sparse for that size or revenue, what is your take on? Yeah, really good question, David. So I spend a lot of time helping organizations assess the data sources that they're going to buy or have bought. A lot of the time, it makes sense to, in someone's head, to think, right, we are, I don't know, we've only raised 2 million, and so we should only be looking at benchmarks in companies that have raised 0 to 5 in that bucket, or whatever the provider gives you in pay. Or maybe it's our revenue is only, I don't know, 5 million or 10 million a year, so we should only be looking at those data points. That is a very valid approach, don't get me wrong, in order to cut the data. But when you apply such specifics, filters, data cut, the data starts to evaporate and disappear. What I always encourage people to do, and I do a lot of it, is pull the all data filter, the broadest set you can get, pull the other ones that you're interested in, and then look at them side by side and look at the sample sizes and look at, does the data actually vary that much? And what you'll find in different data sets, not always the same, but I find a lot that the all data is usually plus or minus 5% on what the client wanted actually to cut their data set by anyway. The sample size is so much more robust and it's so much higher, and there's so many less holes in the data. Using the all data isn't a bad idea. That being said, you could use the all data and then apply a discount or a premium based on some of the inferred data that you've seen. So maybe you are an early stage company And there is some correlation between the fact that the rates are lower for an earlier stage company versus the all data data set. Take the all data and then essentially apply a discount based on what you feel is right. So you can be data driven about what that discount will look like, apply it across all your job families. But again, I would always encourage people to do that analysis or work with me and I can help you do it. Another one from David on comp providers. If you look at various comp providers and you see a variety of midpoints, what is your strategy? Yeah, it is. Okay, right now, David, this is really interesting. I'm doing a client right now. We've got, where possible, the midpoint. You're never going to be able to compare apples to apples because the filters in all of these providers are always slightly different. So if you try your best to apply the same filters, I don't know, let's say headcount 0 to 100, but another provider does only 0 to 200. It's like, you're never going to get the perfect set of filters, but you can line up where possible all the numbers. And then, yes, it's a case of, do you want to take an average of those? Or if they've all come at a cost and you don't want to be year on year paying 10 grand to Mercer and another 10 grand to Radford and 5 grand to so-and-so, I would, as I say, right, we're going to hang our hat on this particular provider. We've looked across all of the others, but we're going to take this one, and that's going to be our number, but we've done our due diligence. Because a lot of people will start off with sometimes one provider, then they'll move to 2 or 3, and then they end up going back and thinking, you know what, we didn't need to pay all that money for another one when the numbers don't differ hugely. But the data provider piece is always predicated on, and I always encourage people to really push anyone you're speaking to give you sample size reports. Can you show me that you've got data for Norway pre-sales engineers? Because we've got 20 of them. Don't let them show you data for Norway for, I don't know, software engineering where they've got the most data, and you really need to drill into it. Hopefully that answered your question, David. Sandra, thanks, really interesting. What do you do when there is no very limited market data available for small, unique industries? Again, I'm not gonna lie, it's really tricky. You have to sort of become a bit like a detective. This is where speaking to the team already, how have they actually come up with these numbers? Where did they actually get them from? Because they clearly didn't pluck them out of thin air. They came from somewhere. So speaking to the team and understanding where they got those numbers from is where I would start. What will come out of those interviews or conversations will be, oh, we use this recruitment report. It's really good. It's, you know, from a recruiter that's well known in our field. They specialize in hiring this super unique, I don't know, aerospace engineer role that builds rockets, which is one I've had recently. And that can be your valid data source. And then you can use that to build upon. So yeah, a lot of the providers won't have data for especially a lot of the emerging roles that are happening right now, especially around the AI piece. So recruitment reports, the people who've got the boots on the ground, looking at job adverts of companies that are hiring, you know, similar roles and looking to see if they've got job salaries on their job adverts, and essentially just trying to build as much evidence as possible and documenting evidence. And another thing, sorry, just while I'm at it, don't put the URL for that job advert in where you got the number from. This is something I've fallen foul of. So, hey, we found a job advert and it's saying X to Y and we think it's exactly like the one we're hiring for. We've got the URL here. You click on the URL and the job advert's been pulled. Take a screenshot of that job advert and put it in your documentation, because the URL dies, but the screenshot won't. So sort of just a quick recommendation there, because I fell foul of that quite badly once and had a load of URLs, clicked on them all and they all died. So all my work went to waste. David, again, thank you. Conscious of time. What is your take on AI and various comp tools like Ravio that try to fill in the blanks? Yes, they do. I don't know. I'll take a pass on that because I partner with quite a few of them, and I don't want to be too open about my thoughts on those. I think they're doing great work. They're using essentially, like you say, they're kind of doing this exponential type model. They're using location differentials to create data in locations where it doesn't exist by using, say, I don't know, they don't have any data for Lithuania for customer success managers, but they're going to use Germany as a proxy and then use a location multiplier. I think these are all very pragmatic ways to do it, and they're things that I do. Whether they should be doing it, I think personally what would be really nice in Ravio is you have the option to see, hey, we've got a hole here and we're not going to fill it, or do you want us to fill the hole? And you click a button and it does all the magic for you. By filling that hole for you and not showing you the fact that there's no data in there, I think it's an interesting one. Flip side, Pave, they don't do that a lot of the time, and they'll be very open when they don't have stuff. So yeah, I think it's an interesting approach that they use, and one that I think, as with a slight tweak, would be really powerful. I think just giving people clarity on, this is what it looks like when we don't have data, and then this is what it looks like when you want to turn the model on, because that's the bit that I think some people, especially I've found when I've had quite data heavy stakeholders, they're like, well, how are they doing this? What magic are they producing? And that's up to obviously Ravio and the client to discuss. And it's usually, they'll say we use models to model it out, but they won't tell you exactly what they do. But Ravio, just to be clear, isn't the only one that does that. And I think they do have information on how it all works, but it does raise eyebrows sometimes, especially with data scientists and engineers in companies that I work with. Try and get through all of these very quickly. Apologies. Caroline, is there a best practice on a maximum band we shouldn't exceed? Pay equity challenge, e.g. is a 50% range defendable? Yes, it is. I think the ranges can be 60, 70% wide sometimes. It all depends on, again, the number of levels you've got, right? I think I had 8 levels in the model that I was showing you earlier. Some companies I've worked with where I only have 5 levels. They just want a really flat hierarchy. Others will have 13 levels. So the width of those levels and the proximity of them will affect essentially what you're defining there, Caroline, as what best practices. So maybe in an organization that has lots of levels, 50% is going to be probably too wide. Whereas an organization that has fewer levels, you're going to want sort of slightly wider bands to to essentially account for a much longer time spent in a range. That being said, bands too wide, people can start to stagnate and think, I'm never getting out of this band. I've been a senior software engineer for 5 years. What the hell? So those are things to consider. Just going to try and get through a few more. Matt, you've built these amazing models, super useful, thank you. A bit long shot, but do you have any experience with funding tools? So to answer Matt's question there, a lot of what I do is I help organizations build their bands, build their strategy, do all the pay equity analysis, get their house in order, so to speak, and then move all of that content. So imagine, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 bands, again, depending on locations and how many job families, move it into something like Lattice, or move it into Leapsum, or move it into HiBob, depending on the comp modules that they have, because those modules will then empower managers to have much more structured conversations that, quite frankly, you're going to struggle to do in spreadsheets. Again, depends on company size, but a lot of what I do is taking this work and then moving it into a HiBob or a corresponding tool. Another question, what is the best way to harmonize the grades obtained through job evaluation methods, Hey? So yeah, there's a Hey jobs methods evaluation. There's a ton of different ways to do it. I'll be brutally honest, the best way of carrying out essentially this is sitting down you need to start with great descriptions. There are tools out there like Gradar, if anyone's heard of that. You can go through and say this job is this, and it will start sort of taking you through a flow. Again, if you don't have budget to do that, you can take your job descriptions. You must start with good job descriptions if you want to level the role, not the soul. Take your framework and without jumping on the AI bandwagon, you can, with the right prompts for free, depending on whichever ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or whatever you're using, can get a pretty accurate and very quick job evaluation done if you give it the right prompts. So you can give it a Hayes type prompt, or you can give it a Radford job evaluation prompt, and it will produce some pretty accurate job leveling that just then should always be validated by a human, and that's ideally the manager that's in charge of those roles. Just conscious we're starting to run out of time. Karen's question, grade R is very cheap. Okay, cool. I've not too sure how much grade R is, but I know there's a few of my clients have used it. Caroline's second question, how do you recommend handling the conversation with individuals who are in the green dots? So I guess, yeah, I mean, with a minute and a half to go, lots to unpack around something like how to handle the people who are above band. I've got on my website, I've got a guide on Notion, just open it up. And on this, and I'll send these links out. Once it opens up, just close. It's going to go to, oh, sorry, wrong button. There we go. In here, under this Analyze Pay Equity, there's a section. And if we scroll right down here, what to do if someone is overpaid. So these are some of the things to think about. If someone is underpaid, someone is within the band, and someone is overpaid. There is no right or wrong conversation to have there, but the most important thing is to have the conversation and let someone know that they're paid above the band. Hey, you're paid above the band. When you get your next promotion, your bump isn't going to be as big as perhaps you anticipate. It really depends on circumstances. Do you want to reward them in some other way that's, I don't know, monetary, perhaps more equity? Or can you reward them in another way that's non-financial, such as, additional learning and development opportunities? But again, you need to make sure if you're doing it for him or her, you need to make sure it's available to everyone if you want to be transparent and fair. But I'd encourage you to have a look through this section to answer that question. And I think that was possibly, hopefully, Caroline, how do you reckon conversations? Last one from David. When it comes to philosophy, I've been seeing a lot of conversations and questions around what to do when someone hits the max of the band yet and they're not ready for the next level. I pretty much probably have that conversation once a week, David. So what he's talking about here is someone who is, let's go down to here, someone who's at the top of the band. There's no business need to move them into the next level. There's no role is open. So how do you keep them motivated? Again, that's when you're going to start to think about the non-financial levers that you can pull in order to keep them motivated. Again, on my guide, I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. Down the bottom here is a section called Total Reward, where I sort of talk about going beyond base salary. And in here, it's exploring the other levers that you can pull. So, equity, bonuses, perks, benefits. But the intrinsic motivators are really what will drive to keep those people engaged. So there's some really good information here on this link. I didn't write this article, but it's a really good article that talks about the fact that, look, the extrinsic reward will eventually start to wane. Everyone gets a pay rise and then 3 months later they want more pay. So you need to think about the other things, so to speak, the intrinsic reasons to keep them engaging. So there's some reading on that there, and it's looking at your whole reward strategy, not just that base pay piece, which is really important to do. Right, thank you ever so much. Hopefully I got through all the questions. I will be sharing all the resources. Hopefully everyone has found this useful, and thank you everyone for joining. And what I'm probably going to look to do is run another session on one of the other topics that I said was out of scope, or perhaps go deeper on some of the topics that I discussed today. So I'll be sending out poll to everyone, and if they want to get involved and join another session, they'll be happy to run one. So cool, thank you ever so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.